You have to give Paul Heyman credit where it's due. If the man was handed a pig's ear, he'd be able to turn it into a silk purse, and he managed to master the skill of repackaging wrestlers that other companies had ruined in the 1990s. In fact, Heyman didn't just reinvent those wrestlers, he gave them new life. He turned jobbers into main eventers and champions, and believable ones at that. In this list, we'll take a look at 10 lucky wrestlers rejuvenated by Paul Heyman in ECW. Steve Austin's run in ECW was brief but absolutely spectacular. Austin only spent 3 months in the company, but did he ever have a lot to get off his chest at the time? Austin had been in WCW between 1991 and 1995. It was a period of his career where he felt frustrated by his mid-card status, and then Eric Bischoff unceremoniously fired him while he was suffering from an injury. With a massive chip on his shoulder, Austin entered ECW in 1995. Paul Heyman handed him a microphone and told him to just go out there and talk. What came next was a series of promos that went down as being some of the greatest promos in wrestling history. In those interviews, Austin spat at Eric Bischoff, WCW and Hulk Hogan. Nobody knew Austin was this good on the microphone before he arrived in Philadelphia, but with Paul Heyman's guidance, Austin created a whole new heel persona that matched ECW's output at the time. The Austin that we saw in ECW formed the basis for the man who would become Stone Cold Steve Austin a couple of years later in the WWF. Mick Foley was another wrestler who entered Paul Heyman's House of Hardcore after suffering a frustrating time in WCW. Foley had always been known for sacrificing his body while portraying Cactus Jack, and that was no different in WCW, where he was taking huge bumps in matches against the likes of Sting and Vader. By 1994, Foley felt that his efforts were not being recognised by the bosses in WCW, and that feeling was only deepened when he lost his ear during a house show match with Vader in Germany. Foley just couldn't believe that the bosses in WCW didn't want to use him losing an ear as part of the storyline. They basically just ignored it. Foley was made to work 4 months' notice in WCW before signing on full-time with ECW, but during that time, he was actually loaned to Paul Heyman thanks to an unrelated court settlement between the two companies, and so Foley, as Cactus Jack, was able to cut a promo in which he spat on WCW's tag team title before throwing it down on ECW TV. That was a decision that greatly angered Ric Flair and other WCW stars, but Foley didn't care. His heart was in ECW, wrapped in barbed wire. When Foley got to ECW full-time, his feuds with Terry Funk, Tommy Dreamer and Mikey Whipwreck are all remembered fondly to this day, along with the incredible promos that came with them. While Foley first became famous to wrestling fans in WCW and would go on to great things in the WWF, it would be in ECW where he would grow his legendary status. Scott Levy is one of wrestling's true journeymen. He wrestled memorably for WCW, the WWF and TNA, but nothing can beat his time as Raven in ECW. In WCW, Levy had been lumbered with the lame Scotty Flamingo gimmick, a surfer dude who actually carried his surfboard down to the ring with him. In 1993, he signed with the WWF as Johnny Polo, a spoiled, rich, preppy kid. After reportedly falling out with Vince McMahon, he was shown the door. This was actually a blessing in disguise, as he would debut in ECW as one of wrestling's greatest ever characters. Raven was almost the total opposite of the Johnny Polo character that he played previously. Gone were the brightly coloured sweaters and the loudmouth brash personality. Here was a loner dressed in grungy jeans and t-shirts, the kind of disenfranchised soul that only the mid-90s could produce. Raven debuted as Tommy Dreamer's former childhood friend, and as you can imagine, they didn't stay friends for very long in the land of the extreme. Memorably, Raven later feuded with the Sandman where the character became truly twisted. Raven brainwashed the Sandman's wife and kid to turn against their dad and join his cult instead. Later, Raven went on to WCW and back to the WWF, but it was just proof that neither company knew how to handle that kind of edgy character. Raven's time in ECW would be the best of his entire career. Many fans will remember Bam Bigelow for his tenures in the WWF and WCW, but his time in both of the bigger promotions were highly frustrating for him and for his fans. Bigelow first appeared for the WWF in 1987, where he made his pay-per-view debut at the Survivor Series, teaming with Hulk Hogan. His first stint in the Federation would come to an abrupt end, but he was suffering from niggling injuries and reportedly fell out with some of the other wrestlers backstage. After a brief stint working in Japan and briefly for WCW, Bigelow returned to the WWF. This time he was positioned as a menacing upper mid-card heel, but he still never managed to break through the glass ceiling. Bigelow wasted the best years of his career thanks to the WWF's bad booking at the time. They were focused on ridiculous occupational gimmicks, and Bigelow's brand of monster heel just didn't fit in to Vince McMahon's cartoon world at the time. Bigelow eventually left the WWF once again and resurfaced in ECW in 1996, and it just felt right. Bigelow fit right into the Triple Threat faction alongside Shane Douglas, Chris Candido and Lance Storm, and his powerful presence and intimidating demeanour quickly made him a dominant force in ECW. ECW was full of talent and innovation, but they were a company of smaller wrestlers. Bigelow filled the monster heel role perfectly. ECW was also the perfect platform for Bigelow to unleash his hard-hitting style of wrestling. The land of the extreme really was the right place for Bigelow to be. Bigelow turned on Shane Douglas and won the ECW World Heavyweight Championship in October 1997. His rivalry with Taz was incredibly intense, culminating in a match at Living Dangerously 98, where he won the World TV title. When Bigelow broke the ring during the match, it went down in wrestling history as an iconic moment. Bigelow would join WCW in 1998, but like so many other wrestlers at the time, he just couldn't get above mid-card level. It quickly became evident that his time in ECW would never be matched. Long before he appeared for ECW and became just incredible, Peter Palaico got what looked like his big break in the WWF. Initially wrestling under the name PJ Walker, he made his debut for the Federation in 1993. Throughout his early years, he struggled to find success as he mostly worked as a jobber. That was until 1994, when he was repackaged as Aldo Montoya. You'd think that at a time when the WWF was specifically pushing cartoon gimmicks directly to children, a masked superstar would go down really well, but not for Aldo Montoya, the Portuguese Manowar, for he looked freaking ridiculous. Even in the mid-90s, when the WWF was specifically pushing smaller guys, the fans just weren't buying what Aldo was selling. He even managed to lose to Mantar at one point. Aldo Montoya never got out of first gear, and he left the company in 1997. In ECW, Paul Heyman promised to make him a star and repackaged him, shaving his head and dressing in an alternative grungy style that was a great fit for the time period. And so, Just Incredible was born. Credible quickly made a mark on ECW as he teamed with Lance Storm to form the Impact Players. Together, they captured the ECW World Tag Team Championship on 2 occasions. The Impact Players were known for their technical wrestling skills and strong in-ring chemistry, and they became fan favourites despite being heels. Credible's credibility was finally found when he became the ECW World Champion. He held the belt for 162 days, successfully defending it against the likes of Tommy Dreamer, Jerry Lynn and Steve Corino, amongst others. As ECW started to slip away, Credible rejoined the WWF, where he's best remembered for for his terrible alliance with X-Pac and Albert as the X Factor. There are few wrestlers who can match the legacy of Terry Funk. Here is one of wrestling's true legends. Funk was an icon of the National Wrestling Alliance with his roughneck brawling style and huge charisma that endeared him to the fans. In 1975, Funk captured the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, which he held for 14 months. Later, Funk ventured to Japan and WCW before briefly appearing for the WWF, and then in 1993 he joined ECW at the age of 49. Funk, as a living legend, really helped to put ECW on the map. He transitioned from the southern style of wrestling to hardcore wrestling as well, and the ECW fans looked upon Terry Funk as a wrestling god. Funk's extensive knowledge of the wrestling business rubbed off on young talents like Tommy Dreamer and Sabu as he shared his wisdom with the locker room and helped them develop their in-ring skills and personas. As a seasoned veteran, Funk brought invaluable experience and credibility to the company, while ECW provided him with a platform to reinvent himself and connect with a whole new generation of wrestling fans. Chris Candido was one of the many promising talents that fell victim to Vince McMahon's occupational obsession, that of lumbering good wrestlers with terrible day job gimmicks. Candido was christened Skip, and alongside Zip and Sonny, they formed the Body Donners, a bunch of gym instructors by day and pro wrestlers by night. The tag team achieved moderate success in the WWF, capturing the World Tag Team titles at WrestleMania 12 in 1996, but it was to be short-lived. As was the story with so many WWF superstars during the New Generation era, Candido was clearly pretty excellent between the ropes and he was fairly charismatic as well, but he was boxed in by his terrible gimmick. Candido managed to escape Vince McMahon's clutches while he was still in the prime of his career, and his move to ECW would be eventually what put him on the map. Candido's time in ECW allowed him to develop his character, which combined his technical wrestling skills with a more aggressive and intense persona. As he joined the Triple Threat stable alongside Shane Douglas, he took on the nickname of No Gimmicks Needed. Candido memorably teamed with Lance Storm in a reluctant tag team to win the ECW Tag Team Championship, which they held for 203 days. The dynamic of the tag team was particularly interesting as the men purported to hate each other, and yet they worked so damn well together in the ring. Candido eventually left ECW for WCW, where he had an unremarkable run. ECW would remain the peak of Candido's wrestling career. Balls Mahoney is yet another wrestler almost wasted by Vince McMahon in the mid-90s. After appearing under his real name of Jonathan Reckner as a jobber in the WWF, he was saddled with the atrocious Santa Claus gimmick. Santa Claus with an X was the evil representation of Santa Claus. Billed as being from the South Pole, Santa enjoyed stealing presents from children. Unsurprisingly, Santa made a couple of appearances in December 1995 before never being mentioned again. But then, just like a Christmas miracle, Paul Heyman appeared and turned Jonathan Reckner's career around. In ECW, Balls Mahoney was able to embrace his hardcore wrestling style, which involved brutal and violent matches featuring weapons such as steel chairs, tables and barbed wire. His newfound persona resonated with the hardcore fan base of ECW, and he quickly became one of the promotion's most popular stars. Mahoney formed a memorable tag team with Axel Rotten. Together they competed in several brutal and violent matches that further solidified their reputation as hardcore icons in ECW. One of Mahoney's most notable rivalries was with Masato Tanaka, which resulted in a series of hard-hitting physical matches that left fans in awe of Mahoney's willingness to sacrifice himself for the cause. ECW's focus on violence and intensity, combined with Mahoney's connection with the fans, made his time in ECW the peak of his wrestling career. On the surface, Doink the Clown looks like an embarrassing comedy wrestling character, and if you tuned in to the WWF around 1994, you'd be right in thinking that. By 1994, the character of Doink was literally just a babyface clown. That version of Doink was not what was originally intended for the character, however. Let's rewind back to 1992, when Doink the Clown first appeared in the WWF. The character was introduced as a sinister, twisted and evil clown who enjoyed playing cruel pranks on his fellow wrestlers, the commentators and even the fans. As a heel, Doink was really effective in drawing heat from the crowd, and Matt Osborne played the character to an absolute T as he combined elements of traditional clown antics with an underlying sense of menace, and he was also really damn good in the ring. Unfortunately, the WWF decided to completely derail what was a really good heel character by turning him babyface, and so the gimmick lost everything that made it special. In reality, Osborne was also struggling with addiction problems, and he left the WWF in 1994. On WWF TV, the Doink character went on to be played by various other wrestlers in the babyface role. Osborne, however, decided to go to ECW. He initially reprised the Doink the Clown character, however ECW's hardcore fanbase rejected the gimmick, no surprises there, and so Osborne and Paul Heyman came up with a twisted version of the character known as Born Again. The idea was that during his time in the WWF, Osborne was sent crazy by being forced to portray the clown character by Vince McMahon and had since developed a dual personality. Born Again was a darker, more violent character who would often paint only half of his face to resemble Doink. This reinvention was a stroke of genius that the ECW fans absolutely loved. Osborne's time in ECW was short-lived as his personal issues caught up to him again, but this was arguably the most interesting time of his entire career. Sometimes the grass isn't always greener on the other side of the park. Shane Douglas found that out back in 1995. Previously, he'd been the main man in ECW in 1994. Douglas signed with the WWF, hoping to achieve even greater success on a bigger stage. However, his time in the WWF was doomed from the start, as old Vinnie Mac gave him the occupational gimmick of school teacher. The newly christened Dean Douglas was a million miles away from his ECW persona. Now he was a condescending school teacher. The fans simply were not interested in yet another hokey two-dimensional character. During his time in the WWF, Douglas also had several run-ins with the Clique, with Shawn Michaels and Scott Hall taking a pretty big disliking to him. Douglas has claimed that the group undermined him both in and out of the ring, actively working to sabotage his push within the company. Both the terrible gimmick and his issues with the Clique doomed Douglas's time in the WWF from the very start. Douglas returned to ECW in 1996. It was less of a reinvention and more of a reversion to his original ECW character. Lucky for him, the ECW fans welcomed him back as one of their most hated heel antagonists. He quickly regained the ECW World Heavyweight Championship and began a series of high-profile feuds with the likes of Raven, Tommy Dreamer and Taz. Douglas came home to ECW and it seemed like he had a renewed passion for wrestling, and he was also able to recapture the magic that had originally made him a star in ECW. For so many wrestlers, ECW was truly their home and the best place for them to perform.